Hey, seventh grade. So, where we left off was Ben is going to the school that will mistreat him, and Odge has decided to stay behind. "I'm Miss Scribble," she said, and the reception clerk looked down in surprise at the small figure dressed in an old-fashioned blazer which had come in out of the dark. "And I have to see—" She broke off because someone had called her name. Spinning around, she saw Ben coming toward her, hemmed in by two men. His face was white. He looked completely exhausted, and the men seemed to be helping him. "Odge," he called again, "what are you doing here? Why aren't you—" The man on Ben's right jerked his arm. "Now then, we have no time to chat." He began to pull Ben towards the door, but Ben twisted around, trying to free himself. "She's dead, Odge," he cried. "My grandmother, she's dead." His voice broke. It was the first time he'd said that word. Odge drew in her breath. Then she looked at the big clock on the wall, 11:15. They could do it if they'd just hurried. "Then you can come with me," she said joyfully. "You can come back to the island." Ben blinked. He shook himself properly awake. He had lost all sense of time sitting by his grandmother's bed. He thought it was long past midnight and the gump was closed. Hope sprang into his eyes. "Let me go," he said, and with sudden strength he pulled away from his guard. "I'm going with her." "Oh, no, you aren't." Stanford grabbed his shoulders. Ralph bent Ben's arm behind his back and held it there. "You're coming with us and pronto. Now walk." Ben fought as hard as he knew how, but the men were strong and there were two of them. And the receptionist had gone into her office. There was no one to see what was happening and help. They were close to the door now and the waiting car, but Odge had dodged around in front of them. "No, Ben, no, you mustn't hurt the poor men," she said. "Can't you see how ill they are?" "Get out of the way, you brat, you ugly little brat. We'll take you too." And Stanford, and he kicked out at her, but Odge still stood there looking very upset. "Oh, how dreadful! Your poor hair. I'm so sorry for you." And without thinking, Stanford put his hand to his head. Then he gave a shriek. A lump of black hair the size of a fist had come out of his scalp. "And that's how it starts," said Odge, "with sudden baldness. The frothing and the fits come later." "My God!" Stanford grabbed at his temples, and another long, greasy wedge of hair fell into the lapel of his suit. "And your friend, he's worse," said Odge. "All those lovely curls." It was true. Ralph's curls were dropping onto the tiled floor like hunks of knitting wool, while round patches of pink skin appeared on his scalp. "Usually there's no cure," Odge went on, "but maybe they could give you an injection here. Some hospitals do have a vaccine. It gets injected into your behind with a big needle, but you'll have to hurry." The thugs waited no longer. Holding onto their heads, trying uselessly to keep the rest of their hair, they ran down the corridor shrieking for help. "Oh, Odge," said Ben, "you did it. You struck them with baldness." "Don't waste time," said the hag. She put her hand into Ben's, and together they bounded down the steps and out into the night. Chapter 20. The three-masted schooner was at the anchor off the secret cove. Beside it lay the royal yacht, with its flying standard, and the charter boat. A number of smaller craft, dinghies, and rowboats were drawn up on the beach. The tide was out. The clean, firm sand curved and rippled around the bay. In the light of the setting sun, the sea was calm and quiet. But the king and queen stood with their backs to the sea, facing the round dark hole at the bottom of the cliff. The cave which led to the gump was surrounded by thorn bushes and overhung by a ledge of rock. It was from there that the prince would come, if he came at all. Flanking the king and queen were the courtiers and the important people on the island. The head teacher of the school had come on the charter boat, and the prime minister had a little girl who had been taught in Latin and won the trip as a prize. And standing behind the king and queen, but a little way off because they still hadn't allowed themselves to wash, were Lily and Violet and Rose. Each of them held a firm, unopened banana in their hand, and their eyes too were fixed on the cave. There were just 2 hours still to go before closing. "Your Majesty should rest," said the royal doctor, coming forward with a folding stool. "At least sit down. You're using up all of your strength." But the queen couldn't sit. She couldn't eat or drink. She could only stare at the dark hole in the cliff, as if to take her eyes from it would be to abandon the last shred of hope. At 10:30 the flares were lit. Flares round the opening, flares along the curving bay, now crowded with the people. A ring of flares where the king and queen waited. It was beautiful, the flickering firelight, but frightening too, for it marked the end of the last day. But surely not the end of hope. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Then from the crowd lining the shore there came a rustle of excitement, a murmuring, and from the queen a sudden cry. A lone figure had appeared in the opening. The king and queen had already moved towards it. When they checked, it was not their son who stood in the mouth of the cave. It was not anyone they knew. In fact, it was a very tired witch called Mrs. Harbottle, holding a carrying bag and looking bewildered. She had heard about the gum from a sorcerer who worked in the job center, and she decided she fancied it. The disappointment was bitter. The queen did not weep, but those who stood close to her could see suddenly how she would look when she was old. Another silence, more ticking away of the minutes. A cold breeze blew from the sea. Rose and Lily and Violet, sorry about that. Rose and Lily and Violet still held their closed bananas, but Lily had begun to snivel. Then once more the mouth of the cave filled with figures, well-known ones this time, and once more hope leapt only to die again. There was no need to ask if the rescuers had, after all, brought back the prince. Cora was bent and huddled into his cloak. Gertie carried her straw basket as if the weight was too much to bear. And where the fern seed had worn off, they could see the ogre's red, unhappy face. From just a few people on the shore, there came hisses and boos, but the others quickly shushed them. They knew how terrible the rescuers must feel, coming back empty-handed, and that failure was punishment enough. Cor was too ashamed to go and greet the king and queen. He moved out of the light of the flames and sat down wearily on a rock. Gertie was looking for Odge and the crowd gathered on the beach. She could make out 2 of Odge's sisters, but there was no sign of the little hag. And trying not to think of what a homecoming this might have been, she went to join Cor and the ogre in the shadows. "We must go speak to them," said the king. "They will have done their best." Yes, but before the queen could gather up her strength, the child who had won the Latin prize put up her hand. "Listen," she said. And the others heard it too. Baying, barking, howling, the sky yelpers were back. They burst out of the opening, the whole pack tumbling over each other, slobbering, slavering, their saucer eyes glinting. Freed suddenly from the tunnel, they hurled themselves about, sending up sprays of loose sand. But not for long. The smell came first, and then Miss Witherspoon holding her whistle. "Sit!" screamed the harpy, and the dog sat. "Grovel!" she screeched, and the dogs flopped onto their stomachs, slobbering with humbleness. "Stay!" she yelled, and they stayed. Then she stepped aside. The smell grew worse, and out of the tunnel, feet first, came Miss Green, Miss Brown, and Miss Jones. The monstrous bird woman's wings were furled, and one look at their smug faces showed the watchers what they wanted to know. Turning, the harpies took their place on either side of the tunnel and stretched out their arms with their dangling handbags. "Lo," they seemed to be saying as they pointed to the opening, "behold, the great one comes." A cheer went up then, to the sound of hurrahs and the sight of waving hands. Mrs. Smith appeared in the mouth of the cave, and in her arms a sack, a large sack, tied at the top but heaving and bulging so that they knew what was inside was very much alive. The prince. The prince had come. All eyes went to the king and queen. The queen stood with her hand to her heart. He had come in a sack, as a prisoner, but he had come. Nothing mattered except for that. But before she could move forward, the chief harpy put up her arms. She decided to drop Raymond at the feet of the king and queen, to sail through the air with him, like the giant birds in the stories. Now she picked up the sack with her talons, unfurled her wings, and circling the heads of the crowd, holding the squirming bundle in her iron claws, she came down and with perfect timing dropped it on a hammock of sand. "I bring you His Royal Highness, the Prince of the Island," said Mrs. Smith, and patted her perm. And here's where we'll stop for today. We'll find out what happens to Ben and Odge and Raymond and everybody else later.